we have Don Sampson, Chief of the Walla Walla Tribe and Climate Change Project Director for ATNI. Don, if you're on camera, also give us a wave. Thank you. Don, a former board member of First Nations Development Institute, is president of Seventh Generation LLC, a tribal advisory and consultation company that works to improve the effectiveness and efficiency of tribal government and business operations. He formerly was the director of Native programs at EcoTrust, a nonprofit organization founded in 1991 based in Portland, Oregon. Don also served as the executive director of the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, located in northeastern Oregon, a position he held from 2003 to 2010. He was responsible for more than 1,500 employees and a $194 million operating budget to oversee all business and government operations. The CTUIR is the government of the Cayuse, Umatilla, and Walla Walla tribes, a confederation formed by treaty in 1855. He served as the executive director of the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission for 5 years. The commission was established by the Yakima, Warm Springs, Umatilla, and Nez Perce Indian tribes in 1977 and assists these tribes with management of the Columbia Basin's salmon resources. He was also chairman of the Umatilla Tribes Board of Trustees, an elected position he held from 1993 to 1997. Don was also a founding board member of my organization, the Bonneville Environmental Foundation. And with that, Don, I am honored to ask you to please do a blessing before we move on.
Thank you, Heather. Welcome, everybody. I'll speak in my native language, which is Walla Walla. And you can pray, meditate in your own way. In me maima machna ticham nakniku wako haulach haulach. Tochonam watat ayat tinoshna titait mamen. Koyam pachach mittat sinuit. Anikanisha kwanamaki tamanwitkinim. Kutsiaya namipia. Today we give thanks to our Creator for this land, for this earth, and ask that you bless and watch over each of us, that we follow the law to Manwit that the Creator has given us. So with these blessings, we call upon our Creator to touch each one of you in our conversation today. Night, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. So with that, we'd like to move into some of the questions to put to our panel today, to ask them about the topic of the panel today, which is the role of conscientious businesses in engaging Indigenous communities. The first question I'd like to ask the panel today is, how can these conference attendees better understand the economic disparity between tribal and non-tribal communities due to generations of paradigms set up on local, state, and federal levels? And I can share my screen now. Don, if you'd like to kick us off.
Sure, thank you. I just want to say all of the panelists are experts on this and understand Native history, but it's very important to understand the history of the country. Go to the very top slide.
Nope.
Go up further. A couple more slides, please. Couple more. There we are. I'm going to cover this, and for people who are more interested, Darrell Kalika, head of the Institute for Tribal Government, has a whole coursework on this. It takes months to understand this, but we're going to cover it in 2 minutes or less. Just so people know, before European contact, our people were healthy, wealthy, culturally and socially strong, and economically independent. Over 12 million people, 500 tribes, and democratic societies, and was the basis for the US Constitution. However, with European contact and the doctrine of discovery, much of our land has been taken, much of our resources have been taken, both from first European countries and then the United States. And these policies have really stopped the advancement of Native people. And part of that is that they have separated the wealth and assets that are rightfully Native and Indigenous people's assets. Next slide. This is a picture of pre-European contact. Imagine tribes in every corner of every part of North America. Very abundant, very wealthy, abundant, healthy ecosystems, clean water, clean air, abundant food source, and economy. Next slide. Many doctrines were established, which basically the doctrine of discovery subjected our lands to governments from Europe who, quote, discovered it and took our property. Later on, there were treaties negotiated between the tribes in the United States, which promised the tribes that had reserved lands and always owned these lands, relinquish some of those lands to the United States, but U.S. promised certain services and federally protected reservations. And so those services include health, education, and economy. But all of those treaties were broken. And of course, people know more and more closely about Lewis and Clark. Really, that core was to establish claim to Indian land in the Pacific Northwest and Oregon Territory. Another shameful part of the U.S. history was President Andrew Jackson removed many of the tribes from their ancestral lands in Southeast United States and to a place called Oklahoma, or Indian country. Next slide. You might have heard of the Trail of Tears. These are the pictures of the historical territorial expansion of the United States. And you can see Great Britain, Spain, France, all laid claim to different parts of native lands and eventually took those lands. The United States ended up buying those lands from these foreign countries underneath of native people's feet. Next slide. As you can see in these slides, original 13 colonies and the expansion to the west, where Indian land was eventually taken, stolen, or traded in terms of treaties. Next. A number of policies were established by the U.S. government, putting Indians on reservations to acculturate, assimilate, and Christianize them. Then those lands later on, those reservations lands that were to be theirs forever, were allotted, and Allotment Act. They divided this land into individual tribal and individual ownership, and the surplus was sold. Over 90 million acres of land were transferred to non-Indians. Later on, they were terminated. Many of these tribes were terminated by Congress. Many of the tribes in Oregon, some 62 individual bands, were terminated. There was also a relocation from Indian reservations into the city, urban areas. 750,000 migrated to the cities in the 50s and 80s. I'm one of them, and many of the people here are part of that. So it's not that long history ago. Next slide. As you can see, the deterioration and separation of the wealth and land of Native America. Next slide. This continues, of course, into the 1890s. As you can see, scattering reservations throughout much of the West. Next slide. There's also this false perception today that our people are of the past and only remnants living on reservations. The current Native population is almost 7 million. That's grown from 500,000 in the 60s. About 20% live on reservations. Many Native populations are in urban areas. Portland, by the way, is the 9th largest with nearly 60,000 from descendants from 380 tribes. But we also have a significant poverty rate, nearly 3 times that of white Americans. Next slide. We also have some of the lowest socioeconomic indicators. Our unemployment rate, 6.6 compared to whites at 3.5. On the reservation, sometimes it reaches 10 times the national average. Education, while we've had increases, and you can see the 4 panelists here, we've all are educated, went to school. Maybe some of our parents did, but for the most part, we're first generation college students. And so while we've advanced a lot, we still have only 14% of Native Americans have a bachelor's degree or higher. Next slide. 14% of households have no access to electricity. This is 10 times higher than the national average. Our life expectancy is 47 compared to 78. Gaming, people talk about casinos, and this is really an advent of tribes, that there's 198 tribes that have gaming compacts out of the 574. So these are agreements with the state. And there's a myth that tribes are rolling in the dough. They've got all the tribes have casinos and they're all wealthy. That's not the case. Next slide. Only the top 20 tribal gaming operations make up 55% of the total portion. of what was now 27.8 billion in gaming revenue. That's declined since 2019 by almost 20% because of COVID. But the important thing is tribes built gaming as a means to bring revenue in, and they're utilizing their profits to be able to create self-sufficiency in government infrastructure on the reservations. You can see many of the services that are funded, but they're also used to diversify economic development both on and off reservation. And that's what we're here to talk about. Thank you so much, and we'll turn it back over to the panel. Thanks for letting me speak this long.
Thank you, Don. And I'd like to invite any of the other panel members that would like to also contribute to this, to answering this first question of how can the attendees better understand the economic disparity between tribal and non-tribal communities. Does anyone else want to contribute to this part of the discussion?
Hi. Good morning, Heather. This is Jarrell. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Jarrell Kalika. I'm a citizen again of the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs. And as Don mentioned, at the Institute for Tribal Government, we do have a certificate in tribal relations. So thanks for making that plug. I appreciate it. And it is a program to help engage folks who are working in this space of working with tribes, building a better understanding. But to go to your question, Heather, and kind of look at that, as I was contemplating this and taking into consideration some of the points that Don was making with regard to this sort of complex history and bodies of law and policy that are sort of overlay engagement with tribes in this country. And it's probably one of the most unique and anomalous bodies of law and jurisprudence in the world related to Indigenous people. But I stepped back and look at that, and I drove over early this morning from Warm Springs back here to Portland. And as I was leaving Warm Springs and Central Oregon and coming over the hill, I just was reminded of how, looking at the landscape of my reservation and how a lot of these policies overlay the actual people who live there, me and my family and the people who live in these communities, and many of people that are on this panel and tribes in the Northwest. And I think about that, and particularly, you know, you see the range and ag out there, you see the mountains out there, the forest resources. So I'd like to go to my first slide because it made me kind of think about this as we were going through. And the theme, you know, taking into consideration the theme of this event is about transformation or transition, excuse me. And kind of thinking about the constant transition that we as Indigenous people have been going through. And I kind of go back to those important resources as I'm thinking about it, because I really got my start in natural resources. And that's, like many of us on this panel, is just deeply rooted in our backgrounds, our heritage, and our worldview, which I think is kind of the anchor to my point here today, and particularly in response to this question, is building that understanding and a mutual understanding and respect for our worldviews. We all have one. We all have a notion and sense of what home means to us, where family fits into our priorities, where we fit into all of that. And I think this last year, I've really had an opportunity to re-examine that. But like I said, a lot of these resources are there, and we see it, and it's in our art forms, and kind of taking that into consideration that our land, our water, our first foods are all important parts of who we are in our worldview. And if you can go to the next slide. And was just laid out, you know, kind of thinking about that transition from this sort of worldview pre-contact into where we have come from historically. My tribe is a confederation of three tribes that are very different linguistically, culturally, and so forth. I come from two of them, the Wasco tribe, which is on the Columbia River, but further sort of like in the Bonneville down and going west, and then the Tyke bands, who are related to Don's people. And so, you know, we have those sort of diversity, but these pictures are of the first, this is Warm Springs, the community of Warm Springs, and the first homesteads, the first efforts to bring sort of this intersection and collision between cultures, differences, economy, and worldviews. If you could go to the next slide. And then I think in this process of transition, you know, thinking about it in terms of that sort of effort to balance out those resources. And I take a look at, again, I'm kind of framing this through my lens of my experience and the experience when I'm sitting down talking with people about how do you engage and think about working with tribes. We're all human beings. There's a human element to all of this. But again, going back to that worldview around resources, I look at, the water resources and how we've been able to integrate, our core principles as tribal people located in Central Oregon with sort of the modern contemporary economic and infrastructure needs that we have. So again, my tribe is a co-owner, co-licensee on the Pelton Round Butte project with Portland General. But we also manage a large swath of timber resources in Central Oregon. And we're also a part of an industry that's part of the forest products industry. So again, to reiterate that we're not sort of these monoliths of history, but we are active participants in society and commerce and economy. And we're in constant situations of balancing those core principles. And then of course, range and ag, my family, I come from a family of fishers, loggers, and ranchers. So again, it's in my own background, it's right there. And like I said at the beginning of my point, is that process of reconciling. If you can go to the next slide. And in this kind of process, as I was thinking about this, tribes are in this constant, I don't know of a tribal council who doesn't sit and wrestle with having to make hard decisions about balancing the environment with developing infrastructure, or balancing environment and approving a timber sale. So there's all of these considerations as tribes are actively looking to participate in sort of their economies, whether that's building housing for their people, or it's improving transportation infrastructure to get goods and services out, whether that's bringing in utility services, electricity, broadband, internet, healthcare, and then of course, for my tribe, water is one of those, and water infrastructure. And kind of thinking back, and you can go to the last slide, Heather, please. Is this process of reconciliation, I think, is really kind of where we're at today in trying to sort of not restore, but to revisit essentially, how do we repair some of the relationships that are there, some of the relationships that may have been eroded by lack of trust or what have you. And so kind of as I'm just kind of wrapping up my initial first points is really kind of thinking about this process and imparting just sort of this small pitch to folks is that, this engagement with tribal communities really is one, shaped by a worldview, but is also intergenerational. And this particular picture is of a student that we had in our Water Summit program. And we partnered with Eugene Water and Electric Board to take the students out to look at one of their hydropower projects. And of course, in that process, it's kind of that bringing together these different communities in these different sectors and starting to build that capacity. But it was a mutual exercise of bringing not only tribal people into this world of looking at infrastructure projects, but it was also an opportunity for us to engage some of the folks on the e-website about why we value these resources, how we look at a hydroelectric project. So again, I know this was kind of a long way to answer it, but I just wanted to, I tend to use images because I'm kind of a visual person. I'm kind of a tactile learner. So that's the way in which, taking in that consideration, just try to impart some of this information in that format. So, so that's my quick answer, Heather.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And I'd love to invite, actually, I'm interested to hear from Chantal on this as well, with your long history of working on policy and testimony to senates and working with governors. What would you say, is there anything that you would want to add to this for our attendees to understand about this history of, I lost my train of thought there, sorry. I'm looking at like 3 different places to get my questions and things and have you guys on the screen. So the history of economic disparity between tribal and non-tribal communities. That's the rest of my thought. Thanks, Chantal, for anything you'd like to add there.
Yes, Heather. Yeah, so the experience, I guess, just to speak from my own phenomenology and, with the comments of Darrell and, the perspectives of what we do go through when you are sitting on council and what you are charged with, not just the, the lives of your own community, but the overall community that you affect both on and off reservation. Council members are really charged with the complexity of jurisdictions and the set boundaries that's in a term that we didn't actually utilize as Native people. We didn't have fences, we didn't have these barriers. We worked differently amongst our tribes and how we communicated it as well. So being able to communicate and develop all at the same time, and wrestling with the fact that, we are faced with contemporary issues, historical trauma, lack of education, which we'll elaborate further into, the next question. But however, with tribal communities and development, we have lacked the ability to actually improve our own environments and the developments that we have because of the jurisdictional issues, having to wrestle with, what's in our control at the same time of protecting, preserving, and or developing further with our own natural resources. And now, of course, the topic comes up with, what wasn't included into environmental perspectives was climate change. Now that's also affecting us in a tremendous impact as of right now. What we would build off of, being able to have our lands to build, being underdeveloped, rural, and now looking at, our own first foods and how to actually fix the deterioration of what's going on. Those are the things that council members are actually having to look at and think that how are we going to solve these issues, and utilize our natural resources and build upon those, and all at the same time of protecting and preserving what we can through policy, advocacy. And our tribes do a great job at, advocating on the highest levels and making that sort of impact. This administration that we're currently going through now has probably been the most beneficial so far, especially with climate change and environmental justice. We're slowly seeing that, but it's coming quick, it's coming fast, and the encouragement is for the tribes to really be on their game with their planners, to have, our policies ready, to advocate, to share the education, systems, and that's how we make, our advocacy sustainable. Learning how to, farm our own lands, how to actually grow, protect, preserve, and have those policies in place. That's the way to actually balance those out from our natural resources, growing them, and then maintaining our cultural environmental nexus. Thank you.
Thank you, Chantal. And I definitely want to bring James into the conversation in a moment. I wanted to ask one question. Both Chantal and Jarrell, you both mentioned first foods. And I was wondering if one of you would mind just giving a little bit of a definition of what that is and how important first foods are, and other firsts for your tribes. Oops. Darrell, oh, sorry, was one of you?
Sorry, it's taking me a while to get the sensor going. Well, yeah, to kind of talk about some of our first foods, and I'm sure my co-panelists could probably do a better job of answering this question. In terms of thinking about that, we have these seasonality with regard to our foods and being able to manage those. We have, our sort of what we kind of typically look at as our male foods, and then we have our sort of women's foods. But it's those resources. I think one of the pictures I had some of our wild daisies up there, which tend to grow with. You can eat the roots of those, but there's also our wild celery, our huckleberries, our roots that come out in the spring. Of course, then we have our salmon, our big game, whether that's deer, elk, bear is also one that we've ate in our area. So that's kind of what we're thinking about when we're thinking about managing those first foods, or those. And then when you take that in a natural resource context, those are really important indicators of the health of our ecosystems and being able to rely on those. So as Chantal was mentioning, that when we're looking at those and being able to restore those, and I was just I had to go get water, frankly, this last yesterday at one of our springs, because again, we're dealing real time with a deteriorating water infrastructure system. So it forces me to go out and to one of our mountain springs that the Natural Resources Program manages. And I get to take a look at some of our huckleberry areas that were burned out during last year's fires. And so just kind of taking those are sort of a quick answer to that. But water, of course, another one of those important first resources that we take into our body.
Thanks for that extra explanation. So I want to kind of transition into the next question, which is very similar to the first question, but I would love to hear from any of you on this particular one as well, especially James, because we haven't heard from you just yet. What are some of the factors that contribute to societal and cultural disenfranchisement?
Hi, so yes, kind of an interesting question because it's, as Don and Chantal and Darrell had sort of expressed, it's a pretty wide-ranging, broad question. But from speaking specifically from an economic standpoint, and really just from a local standpoint, I can speak to how the casinos have benefited our tribe and the tribal members. For me personally, they paid for my education, and they've given me an opportunity to learn and grow in my career, starting out as an accountant and moving up to the position I'm in today. And it's amazing just the impact that only has on me personally, but my family and the community as well. When I go home at night and my kids are running around the house and they're making statements like when I open a business, you know, it makes me feel good, and it makes me understand that as you start to play a part in this dominant community, the ripple effect is tremendous. And so it makes me happy to hear them say that, because then that means that they're seeing the world much differently than the way I saw it growing up. And so for me, that's what disenfranchisement means. Means you don't play a part in a dominant society as a tribe and as a tribal member. As mentioned before, it's great to see the people on this panel and to see how far we've come, and I'm really excited to see where we go from here. We're at a point in time for many tribes who have had economic prosperity. Now we're at the point where we've gained financial capital. Now you can see that we have human capital. And I'm excited to see what the future holds for many tribes. But as Don illustrated, it's really important to understand that not all tribes and tribal communities have benefited from casinos and from economic growth. As you know, big part of business is location. And so if you're in a rural area, it was difficult before, now it's even becoming more difficult. And then with the digital divide, it just adds a really fast, complex barrier to overcome. And so, and one final thing just to keep in mind, Native Americans were given U.S. citizenship on June 2nd, 1924. So we as a people having been citizens for 100 years. So it really says a lot about us as a people in terms of our resiliency and our ability to adjust and adapt to the changing environment. Thank you.
Thank you, James. I'd love to invite any of the other three panelists to contribute to this topic as well.
Yeah, this is Donnie. You know, I agree with James, and we've come a long ways. I'm 60 years old, and when I was younger, we didn't have a whole lot on our reservation. But we did, as was mentioned, our first foods. That's the food that we've always relied on for thousands of years. You know, when the Depression came about, Native people relied on the land and the foods that came from native foods. And so over these years, as we talk about all the federal policies that the US government has imposed on us and held us down and took all of our resources, in a very short period of time, we've come around a long ways in terms of education. You can see the four people that are on here are all educated. We've been able to use that, as James says, that human resource to build our capacity. We took that money and invested from gaming in particular back into our communities to build the infrastructure. Even though the federal government provides limited resources to tribes, we have been building it ourselves, doing it ourselves. Once the US government got out of our way, we started to do it ourselves. And I think that's the key. now we're really advancing into sustainable development beyond gaming, diversifying our resources. And we've got people that are both in business, in environmental fields, as we've talked, that are saying, look, I mean, Nez Perce tribe did a beautiful solar investment on their community to install solar on their in residences in tribal government buildings. Tribes are transitioning from in investing in renewable energy. Tribes are looking at new technologies. Our tribe has a data center and software development center called Cayuse Technologies. So we're really expanding our vision and our sources of investments. Tribes are much more inept in terms of the ability to develop both on and off reservations. You'll see tribes are now looking off reservation in their Aboriginal homelands for economic investments. So the things have changed significantly. And with young people like James and Chantel and even Darrell, that's the future. And I think we're really excited. It's looking much better than it was. With the new administration in place, you know, we had to fight Trump for many years. He was holding us down, and now we've got a new administration that's investing in the infrastructure we need in our Native communities.
Thanks, Don, for sharing all of that. Oh, Chantel, looks like you're ready to say something there. I'll be quiet.
Yeah, thank you. No, I just wanted to kind of emphasize these are all the resiliency of our communities and our Indigenous folks. And, you know, that's basically where we're at now. And being able to adapt and adjust to basically the environment that we were placed in, and how to actually navigate, you know, all the complexities of everything, that those disparities. So kind of taking a different direction to actually explain a little bit further with, you know, if you can even take into context, you know, the factors of societal and cultural disenfranchisement and or disparity, or you can look at them as contemporary issues. You know, everything that our communities had to face, historical trauma. That's a number one there, that, you know, a lot of the factors stem from other, you know, issues, that contemporary issues that we've faced and have overcome or are still dealing with. You know, a lot of the times you'll hear our elected leaders or our communities talk about walking two paths. And that's, you know, walking a non-Native American path, and how we actually uphold our core values that Darrell was speaking of, and how do we hold on to those, and how do we protect them, and how do we revive them, really, when we're losing so much so quickly, especially with our elders going faster and faster each year. Historical trauma is a big one. We have other ones of contemporary issues, disparities of substance abuse. 12% alcohol deaths among American Indians and Alaskan Natives are alcohol related. And that's just a coping mechanism to historical trauma that our communities face. Those also lead to child abuse, sexual abuse, and then these are turned into cycles of trauma, oppression, society, social injustices, and those kind of lead into the lack of quality of education, lack of opportunity, and rural unemployment that they spoke of before. And some of these cycles of trauma and some of our experiences that, you know, again, we're still facing, we're still advocating, we're still fighting, you know, to get those justices or those rights back. Those lead up to situations of, again, we come back to our land and who has jurisdiction over what. Jurisdictional gray areas also lead up to a lack of protection and reporting systems that result into situations of MMIW or MMIP or missing, murdered Indigenous women's or people's rights. These are basic rights, and our communities are lacking those. These lead up to different cases, repeat assaults, failing jurisdiction systems, law enforcement that are left to figure out what has jurisdiction and lack of knowledge to actually uphold what they're charged with. So these are the reasonings of why our community advocate. Myself in particular have advocated for peace officer recognition for our tribal law enforcement, and I know a lot of tribal communities have moved on that as well. These are all the basic rights of human beings that Indian country lacks. But because of other resiliency, like they spoke of, we are having better outcomes more and more with our resiliency, and somehow our communities are still thriving through all of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chantel, so much for all of that insight. I am very excited to have all of you hopefully come back and join us for part 2 of this panel at 11:30 a.m., where we are going to have a little bit more open dialogue. We're going to talk a little bit more about the future, how the tribes approach economic development, entrepreneurship, and how businesses like you all can invest, support, and contribute and make meaningful connections and partnerships with tribal communities. And we'll be taking questions at that time as well. So I hope you all can join us back here at 11:30 a.m. and we'll see you all then. Thank you.